Over dinner, my grandson leaned back in his chair, let his fork clink against the plate, and asked, "What have you ever actually accomplished?" It was the kind of question that came without malice, but also without mercy, flat, unvarnished, as if the words were just stepping stones from one thought to another. No hesitation, no awareness that a sentence can carry the weight of a stone in the gut. His voice wasn't raised. In fact, it was almost casual. But in that casualness lay the sharpness. It's easy to wound when you don't even know you're holding a blade. The kitchen light hummed overhead, casting its yellow warmth on a table cluttered with plates, glasses, and the easy chaos of a family meal. The smell of garlic and butter still hung in the air. His mother scrolled through her phone, one ear half tuned to the conversation, while his younger sister hummed a tune from a commercial she'd just seen on TV. The television murmured from the living room, the volume low enough to be ignored, but loud enough to fill the spaces between sentences. I had my fork halfway to my mouth when he said it. My hand froze midair, but I didn't lower it. I didn't let my face betray the jolt I felt in my chest. Instead, I chewed the silence while the world around me pretended nothing had been dropped into the middle of the table. The rest of them moved on. He reached for his glass of water, his eyes already drifting toward whatever came next in his head. Weekend plans, a video game, maybe a homework assignment. But I heard the echo, not just of the question itself, but of everything behind it. To him, I was a fixed point in the background of his life. Someone who sat in a chair, drank tea, and told the occasional story that might or might not have been true. The years before his existence were foggy to him, compressed into something that could be summarized in a single dismissive sentence. He didn't know the places my hands had been, the nights my eyes had burned under the dim lamplight, the sound of an aircraft cabin breathing differently because of something I had written. I could have answered right then, could have told him about the manuals, about the nights in the hangar with the smell of hydraulic oil thick in the air, about the long tables covered in flight diagrams and maintenance logs. I could have told him that people had walked away from landings they might never have survived if the right words hadn't been on the right page in the right moment. But I didn't, because in that instant I understood something. An answer given too quickly would roll off him like water on a waxed wing. He needed to feel the question's weight before he could carry the answer, so I let the moment pass. They moved on to talk about school schedules, about what time they needed to leave for soccer practice, about whether the store was still open for ice cream. I let my mind drift, not to the present noise, but to the hum of engines idling on a winter runway, to the hiss of wind through an open hangar door, to the sharp smell of fuel, and the faint tick of cooling metal after a long flight. I could almost hear the rustle of the original manuscript pages, their corners curled, smudged with graphite from a dozen rewrites. I could feel the pen in my hand, the ache in my shoulders, the way each sentence was weighed like a part that had to fit perfectly or fail catastrophically. I didn't look at him again until the meal was over. He left the table quickly, as boys his age do, eager for something faster, brighter, easier than sitting across from an old man. I watched him go, his head bent over his phone, and I thought, he doesn't see it now. But one day, he will. And when that day comes, I'll show him, not just with words, but with the proof he can hold in his hands, that accomplishment is sometimes the difference between an accident and a safe landing. That night, as I rinsed the plates and listened to the quiet creak of the house settling, I knew what I had to do. I would find that manual, the one with my words that had no byline but had flown in more cockpits than I ever could. I would put it in front of him, and I wouldn't have to say, "Here's your answer." He would already know. Friends, let's take a short pause. Write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened to you in your life? If you can, please subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow this channel. All right, let's continue. The silence after his question wasn't the kind that invites an answer. It was the kind that spreads, slow and deliberate, until it fills every corner of a room. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, the sound oddly loud now. as if it had been waiting for its moment to be noticed. Somewhere in the living room, a commercial jingle drifted from the television, tinny and far away. Across from me, my grandson had already bent his head over a textbook, flipping pages without urgency. The faint whisper of paper against paper marking his retreat from the conversation he had just opened and closed in the same breath. I studied him, not just his posture, but the space between us. That space was more than the width of a table. It was the years, the worlds we had lived in, stacked like layers of atmosphere. He lived in one where answers were instantaneous, delivered by a search bar, neat and disposable. I had lived in one where answers were earned through repetition, error, and patience that no stopwatch could measure. He couldn't feel the weight of those differences yet. I didn't expect him to, but I felt them pressing on my chest like a slow, steady hand. It wasn't an insult he had given me, though it had teeth. It was a statement of distance. His world didn't have room for the hours I'd spent bent over diagrams in a cold hangar, the ink smudged on my palms from reworking a single paragraph until it could guide a pilot's hand without hesitation. He'd never been in a cockpit during a systems failure, never seen the way a checklist could be the thin line between chaos and control. And because he hadn't, those years of my life were invisible to him, stories at best, myths at worst. I didn't want to snap back with a lecture because lectures build higher walls. I also didn't want to pretend it didn't matter because that's how walls become permanent. So I sat, letting the quiet stretch, letting him stay in his book, while my thoughts wandered far from the kitchen. They went to the sound of wind tearing past an open hangar door at 2 a.m, to the low thrum of an auxiliary power unit humming in the dark, to the feeling of cold metal under my hands as I traced the edge of a wing, knowing someone else's life would one day depend on what was written in the pages on my desk. It struck me that what separated us wasn't just time, it was the way our worlds measured value. He measured in trophies, headlines, and digital likes. My measurements had been quieter, the absence of disasters that might have happened, the flights that landed without fanfare, because everything worked exactly as it should. Achievements so ordinary in appearance that no one thought to ask who had made them possible. He closed his textbook eventually, not looking up, and left the table with a mumbled goodnight. I stayed where I was, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall, the clock resuming its steady count as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had shifted. The gap between our worlds was still there, but now it had a question lodged in it. A question that might one day grow heavy enough for him to want to cross that space and find the answer himself. And when that day came, I intended to be ready. The memory comes back to me not as a scene, but as a smell. The sharp, almost metallic bite of aviation fuel on a cold morning, the way it cut through every other scent until it was the only thing in your lungs. Even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and feel it cling to my jacket, my hair, my hands, seeping into the fabric until no amount of soap could take it away. Back then, that smell wasn't just part of the air. It was a warning and a promise. It meant the machines were alive, ready to leap into the sky or betray you in an instant if you misunderstood them. I was young, but the hangars made you grow up fast. They were cathedrals of steel and echo, where every sound seemed amplified. The hiss of hydraulics, the click of tools against rivets, the heavy clank of a wheel chock hitting the ground. And then there was the roar of the engines, a deep, layered sound that went beyond hearing, something you felt in your chest and bones. You could stand 30 feet away from a running turbine, and it would still vibrate through you, rearranging the beat of your own heart. We worked in cold that could make your fingers clumsy and heat that could wring you dry, sometimes both in the same day. Every task demanded precision. A loose wire wasn't a small mistake. It was a hidden blade waiting to strike. A wrong number in a checklist wasn't a typo. It was an invitation for disaster at 20,000 feet. We didn't think in terms of convenience or shortcuts. We thought in terms of survival, ours and the crew's, and the passengers who would never know our names. I remember the way the metal skin of the fuselage trembled under my hand when the engines spooled up. You could feel the hunger in the machine, its readiness to launch itself into the air. and you could also feel its need for guidance. Aircraft are obedient but not forgiving. They will follow your instructions exactly, even if your instructions are wrong. That truth was burned into all of us, line by line, mistake by mistake, until it lived in our muscles as much as in our minds. It was in those long shifts, half bent under wings and leaning over instrument panels, that I began to understand the need for a guide that could live outside a person's head. Not everyone could carry the whole map in their memory, not when adrenaline was high, when the unexpected hit, when seconds mattered. What we needed was something that could stand in for calm judgment when calm was impossible. Not just a list of steps, but a lifeline disguised as paper. I didn't think of it as a manual yet. At the time, it was just notes in a battered notebook. Oil stains soaking into the corners. My handwriting cramped into the margins, where I'd corrected some official instruction that wasn't quite right in practice. But even then, the idea had already rooted itself in me, somewhere between the smell of kerosene and the vibration of the metal skin under my palm. If a single page could save a life, then every page needed to be written as if it would. That world, loud, dangerous, unrelenting, never let you forget that each detail was life or death. It shaped me in ways my grandson couldn't see yet. And maybe, when the time came, I would find a way to let him step into that world for just long enough to understand why the question he asked at the dinner table had an answer worth more than he could imagine. The first lines of what would one day become the manual were never meant for anyone's eyes, but mine. They lived in a battered, soft-spine notebook I kept in my jacket pocket, its cover worn smooth from sliding in and out against metal ladders and tool belts. The pages were thick with fingerprints, dark smudges of engine grease, faint rings from coffee cups balanced too close, graphite streaks where my pencil had skidded in turbulence or cold. It didn't look like the seed of anything official. It looked like the private shorthand of someone trying to keep up with a world that moved too fast. I began writing in it almost without thinking. It started with small corrections to the procedures we already had, things every mechanic and flight engineer knew in practice, but that were missing from the neat printed checklists. Instructions written for a perfect day in a perfect hangar didn't always hold when you were under the wing at night, the wind cutting through your gloves, trying to stop a leak before the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. So I wrote down the things that actually worked: how to lock a stubborn latch without bending the housing, how to listen for the pitch change in the auxiliary unit that told you the pressure was just right, where to put your hands when you couldn't see the part you were fixing. The notes grew longer. Paragraphs formed. Some pages were entirely dedicated to what I called if-then thinking, what to do if an alarm failed to sound, if a sensor gave a false reading, if the instruments disagreed with what your own senses told you. I wrote them as if I were speaking directly to the person who would need them, keeping my tone calm, my steps short and clear. In my mind, I imagined that person in a tight space, breathing too fast, trying to remember their training. I wanted my words to be a steady hand on their shoulder. No one else cared about these scribbles. To most of my coworkers, the notebook was just my odd habit. They had their own tricks, kept in their heads, passed around in stories over coffee breaks. We were all problem solvers, but few saw the value in capturing those solutions on paper. "That's just how you learn the job," they'd say, as if the only way to gain knowledge was to live through the mistakes yourself. But I had seen enough close calls to know that not everyone survived their mistakes. I didn't yet realize that what I was building could outlast me. At the time, it was just insurance against my own memory failing, against the chaos of a bad day, against the loss of someone because we didn't share what we knew. Still, I found myself treating those pages with a care I didn't give to anything else I owned. If my jacket got soaked in the rain, I would dry the notebook, page by page. If my pencil broke mid-note, I'd carve a fresh point immediately, rather than risk losing a thought. It was as if the words themselves had a different kind of weight, heavier than their thin lines suggested. Years later, when those same words would be typeset on crisp white paper, bound and stamped with an official seal. I'd remember those first nights, me crouched in a corner of the hangar, the smell of kerosene thick in the air, the hiss of a cooling engine filling the silence, my pencil scratching across the page. Back then, no one thought these notes would matter beyond my own hands. But I already knew the right words, in the right order, could keep someone alive. And that was reason enough to keep writing. They came into my life quietly, one at a time, as if the sky itself had decided to send me teachers disguised as ordinary men. None of them were the kind who made speeches or liked the sound of their own voices. They spoke in short sentences, low and steady, and when they offered you something, it was never for show. It was because they thought you might actually use it. The first was Captain Sokolov, a man whose face was so weathered it looked like the wind had carved it. He had a habit of leaning against the nose of his aircraft after a flight, lighting a cigarette, and staring at the horizon as if he were reading a language the rest of us couldn't. One evening I found myself standing beside him in the twilight, both of us silent. Without looking at me, he flicked ash onto the tarmac and said, "The manual tells you where the switches are. It doesn't tell you which ones to touch when you can't think straight." Then he told me a story about a storm over the Urals, about a co-pilot freezing up, about hands moving on instinct. That story ended up as 3 lines in my notebook, 3 lines that could fit in a pocket but carry a man home alive. Then there was Andrei, an engineer who had flown as often as he had fixed. He had a knack for tracing problems backward, from the symptom to the cause, like unwinding a knot you couldn't see. He once pulled me aside during a night shift and handed me a hand-drawn diagram. "This is how the fuel lines really breathe," he said. "The blueprint they give you is clean. This is the truth." The lines on his paper were uneven, some darker where his pencil had pressed harder, but I copied them into my notebook exactly. His truth would later become one of the diagrams in the official edition, printed neat and perfect. But I never forgot the original, with the smudge from his thumb where he'd held the paper too long. There were others. A radio operator named Mikhail, who could coax clarity out of static when no one else could, teaching me how to listen between the noise. A navigator who had a map of the clouds in his head and explained to me how to read a weather front the way you read a person's mood. Look at the edges first, not the center. They gave me things they didn't write down themselves, not because they wanted to keep them secret, but because their knowledge lived in muscle and instinct, and no one had ever asked them to trap it in words before. I realized slowly that these moments, these short, half-whispered exchanges on the edge of duty, were as valuable as any official training. They were the unwritten manual of survival, the kind that existed only in the minds of those who had flown enough to understand that rules were just the start. My notebook began to swell, not with cold procedures, but with the warmth of lived experience, with the fingerprints of men who had seen the sky's mercy and its cruelty in equal measure. Sometimes I would look at the pages and think about how fragile they were. If I lost that notebook, all of it would scatter back into the air, those voices, those sketches, those little shortcuts that could mean the difference between landing and not. It was then I understood that what I was building wasn't just mine. It was a distillation of hundreds of flights, thousands of hours, decades of mistakes avoided or corrected. I was only the keeper, the one willing to put it into lines of text so it could outlive the men who had given it to me. And I think they knew it too, because every so often one of them would catch my eye after passing me a note or diagram and give a small nod, as if to say, "You'll know what to do with this." And I did. I was already building something they'd never see in its final form, but they were part of it all the same, the silent allies with keys to the sky, unlocking a door I didn't yet realize would change more lives than my own. The hangar at night was a world apart from the bustle of daylight. During the day, it rang with the clang of tools, the barked orders of foremen, the whine of drills and the groan of hydraulic lifts. But after midnight, the noise died to a hum. The distant tick of cooling metal, the occasional drip of water from a pipe overhead, the low, constant breath of the auxiliary units keeping systems alive. The air was thick with the mingled scents of fuel, oil, and the faint metallic tang that seemed to live in the steel walls themselves. This was the time I worked best, when there were no distractions, no urgent voices breaking my concentration, only the steady march of my own thoughts and the thin scratch of my pencil. I would spread my notes across the workbench in an ordered chaos, pages smudged with fingerprints, diagrams with arrows looping in 3 different colors, tiny corrections scrawled between typed lines. Each paragraph I touched had to serve one purpose: survival. If it didn't make that purpose clear, I tore it apart and started again. This wasn't about writing something that sounded smart. It was about writing something that a pilot, dizzy from smoke or noise, could follow without hesitation. In a crisis, the mind narrows to the size of a keyhole, and if the instructions didn't fit through that keyhole clean and sharp, they were useless. I read each sentence aloud, not in the measured tone of a calm room, but in the clipped, urgent cadence of someone fighting for control. If I stumbled over a word, it was the wrong word. If a sentence took too long to say, it was too long to use. I imagined hands trembling over switches, eyes darting between failing gauges, the sting of cold air or burning heat in a cabin, the roar of wind or the dead silence of a stalled engine. The instructions had to cut through all of it like a lifeline tossed into dark water. Some nights, I would spend an hour on a single diagram. The official manuals often used lines so clean they erased the reality of the machine's complexity. So I drew them the way the crews saw them, bolts and fasteners included, small scuffs marked, the real angles that a flashlight beam would cast in the dark. I labeled things in the order your eyes would naturally find them, not the order some drafter thought looked neat on a page. The hours before dawn were the hardest and the clearest. Fatigue stripped away the excess. Only the essential remained. My hands ached from gripping the pencil. My eyes burned from leaning too close to the light, but I pressed on. Every page I finished felt like a piece of armor forged, not for me, but for someone I might never meet, someone who might one day find themselves alone at 20,000 feet with alarms screaming in their ears. I didn't think of it as noble work. In those hours, it was simply necessary. The aircraft didn't care how tired I was, and neither would the emergencies it might face. The manual had to be better than memory, better than instinct, better than fear. So I stayed until the first gray light slid under the hangar doors, gathered my pages into a neat stack, and slid them back into the folder that had become my most guarded possession. Walking out into the morning air, my body heavy from the night's labor, I would glance back at the hangar, at the shadowed shapes of the machines I'd been serving, and feel a quiet certainty settle in my chest. No one would see the work I'd done. No one would thank me for the hours stolen from sleep. But I knew that somewhere, someday, those words might keep a set of hands steady, long enough to bring a plane home. And that was worth every minute stolen from the night. It was supposed to be a routine training flight. Clear skies, light wind, the kind of day instructors love because it makes everything predictable. I wasn't on board. I was in the hangar, finishing a set of revisions, when the first call came through the radio. There was no drama in the voice, just clipped urgency. A system failure, a procedure in progress, a request for confirmation. The room around me seemed to shrink, my pencil freezing mid-sentence. I knew the checklist they'd be using. It was the official one, the same I'd been quietly rewriting in my own time for months. And I also knew the flaw that lived in it, a small but dangerous ambiguity buried in the middle of the emergency sequence. 15 minutes later, the noise came, low at first, then building into a sound no one mistakes once they've heard it. The thud and screech of metal surrendering to the ground, the muffled concussion of impact rolling through the air like an aftershock. We ran. Out of the hangar, across the tarmac toward the black smudge of smoke curling into the perfect blue above the far end of the runway. I remember the heat hitting my face before I saw the wreckage, the acrid taste of burning insulation on my tongue. And then the shapes, twisted, unrecognizable, the metal skin torn back like pages in a book someone had tried to rip apart. They pulled the instructor out first. His face was pale beneath the streaks of soot, his eyes unfocused. The trainee followed, conscious but shaken, his hands clenching at nothing. They were alive. thank God, but one of the ground crew was already whispering what I feared: the wrong sequence, the wrong timing, confusion in the cockpit. They had followed the manual to the letter. The problem was the letter had been wrong for years, carried forward in print after print because no one had taken the time to rewrite it the way a pilot actually needed to read it. That night, I couldn't sit still. I kept seeing the smoke, hearing the scrape of boots on tarmac as they dragged the hose closer, smelling the burned plastic that had lodged itself into my hair. I pulled the official manual from my bag, opened it to the page I knew too well, and stared at the lines that had nearly cost 2 lives. I flipped to my own notes, my handwriting tighter and darker, each step clear, each hazard marked in plain words. If those words had been in the cockpit that day, the outcome might have been different. It was no longer just a project after that, no longer something I worked on because I believed in doing things right. It became a vow, as solid as any I had ever made. I would finish the manual. I would make it clear enough, simple enough, accurate enough that no pilot would have to waste seconds deciphering instructions while the ground rushed up at them. I didn't care if my name was on it or not. I didn't care if the department approved every change I made. I cared only that it existed in the hands that needed it in the moments when need was all there was. The next day, I returned to the hangar before sunrise. I spread my pages out on the workbench, hands steady in a way they hadn't been for years. Every line I wrote from then on carried the image of that smoking wreck in the corner of my vision. Every sentence was tested against the question, would this make sense to someone whose pulse was pounding in their ears? If the answer was anything but yes, it was rewritten until it could pass that test. From that day forward, the manual wasn't just my work. It was my promise. And promises, I had learned, were not things you broke and still called yourself whole. It happened quietly, without any warning, the way real betrayals often do, not in the heat of an argument, but in the cold, tidy silence of paperwork. I had been working late for weeks, the manual now a living thing sprawled across my desk, pages marked in red and blue pencil, diagrams refined until the lines felt like muscle memory. I was nearly done, close enough that I could feel the weight lifting from my shoulders. One morning, I came in to find the folder gone. At first I thought I'd misplaced it, left it in the drafting room, or tucked it under a pile of reference books. But after searching every inch of the hangar office, I knew it had been taken. By noon, I found out where. The head of the department, an immaculate man with pressed uniforms and a smile that never touched his eyes, was standing in the conference room with a stack of fresh printed pages in front of him. I knew those pages before I even saw them. My words, my diagrams, my sequence charts, each detail polished through nights of exhaustion. But the cover bore his name. No mention of mine. The acknowledgement section, where I had humbly listed the old pilots and engineers who'd given me their insights, was stripped away. It was as if the work had been born in his hands, perfect and whole, without a single trace of the nights I had bled into it. I stood in the doorway, unseen for a moment, listening to him speak. He called it our department's latest safety initiative. He spoke about the importance of clarity in emergencies, about the need to update outdated procedures. Every word was true, but every truth he spoke had been stolen. The staff around the table nodded, some taking notes, others already imagining the commendations that might follow. I felt the air thicken in my lungs. I wanted to step forward to say, "That's mine." But in that room, my voice would have been a stone thrown into a river, swallowed without a ripple. The next blow came later that day, when I saw the stamped approval form on his desk. The manual had already been sent up the chain for official clearance, the kind of bureaucratic seal that, once given, could not be undone without months of resistance. My name was nowhere in the record, legally, officially, in the eyes of the service. I had contributed nothing. I was invisible. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, with the last handwritten drafts I still had, copies I'd kept for my own revisions. My hands hovered over them, torn between rage and the urge to protect what little remained in my possession. The anger was sharp, but underneath it was something heavier, the hollow ache of knowing that the work I'd poured myself into was no longer mine in the eyes of the world. The vow I had made after the accident still burned inside me, but now it had been hijacked, paraded under another man's banner. I thought of the 2 pilots from the crash, alive but scarred by that day. I thought of the next crew that might need these words, and how they would read them without ever knowing who had fought for their clarity. Maybe that anonymity didn't matter if the manual saved them, but the theft cut deep, not because of ego, but because I had trusted that the truth of the work would protect itself. I had been wrong. As I sat there, the pages spread before me, I realized something else. The words might have been stolen, but the mind that shaped them wasn't. They could take the manual, stamp it, claim it, but they couldn't take the knowledge out of my hands, or erase the fact that every line had been written with a purpose only I truly understood. And somewhere inside me, that understanding was already beginning to form into a different kind of promise, one that would outlast the theft. The years that followed moved with the slow, steady rhythm of propellers in the distance, constant, unrelenting, and far away from me. The manual, my manual, was printed in thick, bound volumes, the kind that sat in every cockpit, every training center, every briefing room across the country. I saw it once in the hands of a fresh-faced pilot at a coffee shop near the airfield. He flipped through the pages with the casual confidence of someone who trusted the words implicitly, never suspecting that the man at the next table had written every line. In photographs from industry ceremonies, I would catch sight of the department head, my author. He'd be shaking hands with generals, standing beside gleaming aircraft in hangars filled with applause. His smile was always the same, measured and immaculate, and behind him, on banners and podiums, was the title of the manual that had saved more lives than anyone would ever count. Pilots and engineers praised his foresight, his decades of experience distilled into words, and I would raise my glass from the farthest corner of the room, letting the praise pass by me like wind over a wing. I learned to stand in the shadows at these events, close enough to hear the speeches, but far enough that no one thought to ask me what I did. I would watch the young crews, men and women barely older than my grandson, listening intently, their eyes sharp, their pens moving across notepads. They didn't know that the diagrams they were memorizing had been redrawn dozens of times under the yellow light of my desk lamp. They didn't know the cadence of those sentences had been tested aloud in an empty hangar, so that in the panic of a real emergency, they would land in the brain like instinct. The first time I heard a pilot say, "That manual saved my life," it was at a small gathering after a storm grounded half the fleet. He was speaking to the author, his voice thick with gratitude. The man accepted the thanks with a solemn nod, placing a hand on the pilot's shoulder like a priest blessing a parishioner. I stood 3 feet away, sipping my drink, and in that moment I felt two truths at once: the sharp sting of having my work claimed by another, and the quiet, stubborn relief that the words, whoever's name was on them, had done exactly what I wrote them to do. Over time, the sting dulled, but it never vanished. It settled into me like an old injury, one I could walk with, even run with, but that still ached when the weather turned. I stopped expecting recognition, stopped imagining that the truth would somehow rise to the surface on its own. My name had been erased from the record, and no ceremony or official archive was going to put it back. Yet I stayed close to the work in my own way. I kept flying as a ground instructor, drilling cadets on the very procedures I had once fought to write clearly. I taught them not just what to do, but why. How each step in that manual had been shaped by sweat, mistakes, and the ghosts of close calls. And when they thanked me after class, I would smile and wave it off, knowing they would never guess that I had once written the words they now carried into the sky. I learned to measure my satisfaction in quieter units, in the absence of certain accidents, in the smooth landings after sudden failures, in the way a pilot's voice stayed calm on the radio when things went wrong. The manual had become part of the air itself, invisible but vital. And if my role in it was invisible too, I told myself, then perhaps that was the way it was meant to be, at least for now. It started happening more often than I ever expected, not to me directly, never to me, but in the quiet lines of news reports, in the terse voices of radio transmissions replayed on television, a twin-engine transport losing hydraulics over a frozen airstrip, the crew making the textbook corrections with seconds to spare. A passenger plane hit by lightning on approach, one engine coughing out mid-descent, yet touching down smooth enough that most passengers only learned the truth once they were safely inside the terminal. I would sit in my armchair with the paper folded across my knees, eyes lingering over the details the journalists barely noticed. The captain initiated the emergency landing sequence per procedural guidelines. The crew followed checklist C-17 without deviation. That checklist had been born on my desk, line after line, distilled from the chaos of mechanical failure into something that could be understood at 300 knots, with alarms screaming in your ears. They didn't know it, but in a way I had been there with them in the cockpit, whispering each step in the right order. Sometimes the stories came with photographs, crews standing stiffly in front of the aircraft, wind whipping their jackets, relief and exhaustion etched in their faces. I'd study those faces not to find recognition, but to feel the weight of what had been spared. The calls to next of kin that never had to be made. The funerals that would never be planned. There was one winter when the snowstorms came back to back, grounding half the fleet for days. I spent those evenings in the glow of the television, watching interview after interview with pilots who spoke about muscle memory and clarity in chaos. They praised the manual for its simplicity, for making hard choices feel like instinct. Not once did anyone ask who had actually written it. It had simply been there, as natural as the yoke in their hands or the sky outside the windshield. And in a strange way, that anonymity carried its own kind of peace. The manual had outgrown me. It no longer needed my name to do its work. It had entered that rare category of things that exist without being noticed, like air pressure or gravity. Essential, invisible, constant. But there were moments, late at night, when the pride and the ache collided. I would remember the feel of those early drafts, smudged with oil from my hands. I'd remember the accident that had started it all, the vow I made beside the twisted wreckage that no one else should die because of unclear instructions. Those memories reminded me that what I had built wasn't just paper and ink. It was a bridge between survival and disaster. I never clipped those articles for myself. I didn't need to. They lived in my memory, strung together like silent log entries in a ledger only I would ever read. And with each one I understood more deeply that there was a quiet kind of authorship in letting your work belong entirely to the people it was meant to save. When I finally mentioned it to him, it wasn't in the form of some carefully prepared revelation. No dramatic pause before the words, just an offhand thread woven into the fabric of an ordinary evening. We were in the kitchen, the air heavy with the scent of oversteeped tea, and the faint metallic note of the radiator kicking on. He was half sitting, half slouched at the table, his eyes glued to the glowing rectangle of his phone, thumbs moving in a steady rhythm. I had been listening to him explain a video game he'd been obsessed with lately, something about flying over futuristic cities, landing on impossible runways, pulling off stunts that defied every law of physics. There was a glint in his voice when he talked about it, the same one I'd once had at his age, only mine had been about the real sky. Somewhere between his descriptions of neon skyscrapers and turbo boosts, I'd smiled and said, almost absently, "You know, in real life it doesn't work like that. Flying's not so forgiving. Manuals save lives." Then, with the kind of quiet pride that had lived in me for decades, I added, "I wrote one once." The reaction was instant, and it was nothing like the one I'd imagined in the small, foolish corner of my mind that still hoped for awe. He lifted his eyes for the briefest second, just enough to acknowledge that I'd spoken, but his expression barely shifted. No curiosity, no surprise. A quick, polite shrug, and his gaze slid back down to the screen in his hand. That was it. In that shrug, I read an entire verdict. Grandfathers tell stories, and stories are just soft-edged myths from a time that doesn't matter anymore. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't even rudeness. If anything, it was worse. It was the casual dismissal of someone who has grown up in a world where proof comes in high-definition images and instant search results, not in the weathered voice of a man whose best years were lived before he was born. In his mind, if I couldn't pull up a video, a document, or an online archive in the next 30 seconds, then it might as well never have happened. I sat there with my hands wrapped around the warm mug, feeling the silence grow heavier between us. I thought about telling him, really telling him, about the nights I'd worked alone in the hangar, the smell of kerosene soaked into my coat, the biting winter air that made the metal of the tools burn against my skin, about the accident that had burned itself into my memory and the promise I'd whispered to no one but myself on that cold, echoing runway, about the hundreds of drafts, each word chosen so a pilot in the worst moment of his life could find calm and clarity in the space of a heartbeat. But I didn't. I knew how it would sound to him now, like static from another century, too far away for him to believe it could have weight. The kind of story you nod at politely, and then forget as soon as your phone buzzes. And that somehow would hurt more than if he argued with me outright. So I let it go. I let him dive back into his game, explaining his latest victory, the new map, the way the clouds in the simulation looked almost real. I listened. I smiled when it was my turn to respond, and I let him keep the world exactly as he saw it, because I knew something he didn't. One day, he would hit a moment where the question would come back to him, not out of boredom or skepticism, but out of a genuine need to understand. And when that day came, I wouldn't answer him with words that could be shrugged off. I would hand him proof, something he could hold, something no screen could diminish, and in that moment, he would see. He had not stepped into the State Aviation Archives in more than 30 years, and as he approached the weathered concrete building on the edge of the airfield, it felt less like walking toward a storehouse of documents, and more like approaching a sealed vault of his own life. The winter air was thin, sharp, and heavy with the faint smell of jet fuel drifting from the active runways nearby. Each step toward the door carried with it a strange mixture of dread and anticipation, because inside, past the dull metal detectors and the yawning corridors, lay the one place that still held an unaltered record of who had truly built the words that saved lives. The archivist on duty didn't recognize him. She saw only another aging man with a request and a worn leather satchel. He filled out the forms in slow, careful handwriting, the way his instructors once taught him to print checklists. Neat, deliberate, impossible to misread. When she returned with a box, plain brown cardboard, its edges softened by decades, he felt the pulse in his neck quicken. This was the year he'd been thinking of, the first edition, the version printed before politics and hierarchy could carve his name away. He pulled on the thin cotton gloves they required and lifted the lid. The air inside smelled of old paper and dust, a scent that carried the weight of hangars, briefings, and long nights bent over diagrams. He opened the first manual carefully, the spine creaking like an old door. Page after page, his eyes scanned the columns of text, not for the polished, printed sentences, but for the margins, and then he saw it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Slanted slightly to the right, the loops tight and disciplined from years of filling logbooks, his own. Pencil marks, faint but stubborn, ran alongside the official lines. Notes about angle of descent in crosswinds, underlined warnings about engine restart sequences. A small hand-drawn diagram of fuel flow that he'd sketched during an all-night review session. Every mark exactly as he had left it, unedited, untouched, still breathing the urgency of the night it was written. His fingertips hovered over the paper, just shy of touching, because contact would smudge the graphite. A quiet heat spread through his chest, not pride exactly, not triumph, but the deep anchoring knowledge that the truth hadn't vanished. It had simply been sleeping here, waiting for him to open the box. Outside, the world could argue names, titles, and credit. Inside this archive, the facts whispered in pencil strokes that had outlived promotions and politics. He sat there longer than he meant to, letting the silence of the room and the dim, filtered light wrap around him. For years he'd told himself that proof no longer mattered, that lives saved were enough. But seeing those notes now, seeing them exactly as his hand had left them, he felt something shift inside. This was more than paper. This was the living bridge between who he was then and who his grandson thought he was now. He closed the manual with the care of someone tucking in a sleeping child and slid it back into the box. There was no ceremony in leaving the archive, no music, no applause. But as he stepped back into the cold, he carried something the wind couldn't scatter. The road back home felt different now, because somewhere between those shelves he had found the first solid piece of the answer his grandson didn't know he was waiting for. He came home later than usual that evening, the cold clinging to his coat and the weight of the archive's box still heavy in his hands. The manual was not pristine. Its cover was faded, the edges frayed from years of handling, and the stamp, for official use only, had bled into the paper over time, a soft blur of authority that no one bothered to refresh. But to him it was as alive as the day it was first printed. Every crease was a fingerprint of history, every smudge a reminder that this book had been carried into cockpits, flipped open in turbulence, leaned on during moments where hesitation could mean disaster. He didn't call for his grandson immediately. Instead, he set the manual on the kitchen table, letting it rest in the same spot where a week ago they had eaten together in silence after that question had been asked. What did you ever accomplish? The question had hung in the air for days. And though he hadn't answered it then, tonight the answer was going to take shape not in words, but in something his grandson could see, touch, and feel. When the boy finally wandered in, headphones still looped around his neck. The manual's presence on the table drew only a quick glance at first. But then, curiosity began to pull at him. It was the weight of the object, the way the pages looked older than anything he'd ever held, the quiet defiance of its survival. He approached, leaning over as his grandfather slowly opened it to a section somewhere in the middle. The paper crackled softly under his gloved hands. There it was, on the right-hand margin of a checklist for in-flight engine restart procedures, a narrow column of handwritten notes in pencil. Not random scribbles, but precise, confident lines. A sentence rewritten in simpler language so it could be understood under stress. A diagram of throttle positions, drawn in miniature but crystal clear. An asterisk next to a step that had once been buried in dense technical jargon, but now stood out in plain sight. This, the old man thought, is the line between guessing and surviving. The boy's gaze lingered longer than expected. His eyes traced the pencil marks, moving between the handwriting and the printed words, as if piecing together the relationship between them. He didn't speak, not yet, but there was a change in the air, a stillness that meant something inside him had shifted. His grandfather stayed silent too, letting the proof do the speaking that years of explanations never could. In those quiet minutes, the room seemed smaller, as if it contained only the two of them and the hum of the refrigerator. Generations apart, but bound now by the thin gray lead that had survived decades, unedited and undeniable. The old man realized he wasn't just giving his grandson a manual. He was handing him a fragment of the sky, captured on paper, where his own voice had once spoken to pilots, in moments when seconds were worth more than gold. When the boy finally looked up, he didn't ask the question again. He didn't have to. The boy didn't rush. He turned the pages slowly, the way someone handles something fragile, not just because the paper was old, but because the weight of what it carried had begun to settle on him. His fingertip moved along the edge of a sentence, then paused over one of the pencil diagrams, tracing the small arc of a fuel line as if by feeling the groove of the graphite he could reach through time and touch the moment it was drawn. He didn't know the smell of aviation fuel the way his grandfather did, or the sound of an engine coughing back to life thousands of feet in the air. But here, in this kitchen, lit by a single warm lamp, he could sense that the man across from him had lived in a world where mistakes had no second chances and had done something about it. The playful skepticism that had colored his earlier question was gone, replaced by a quiet focus, as if he were reading not just words, but the measure of the man who had written them. The old man watched without speaking. He had learned long ago that respect couldn't be commanded, only earned, and even when earned, it often arrived silently, without fanfare, without declarations. Tonight, He felt that silence growing between them, but it was no longer the cold, distant kind. It was the stillness of recognition, the moment when someone sees a truth they can't unsee. The boy glanced up at him, and in that look was the first flicker of something different. Not pity, not familial obligation, but genuine regard. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was just there. A shift in the air, a thread tying them closer, invisible yet impossible to break. For the first time since that blunt question had been asked, the old man felt no need to explain himself. The pages had done the work, the pencil marks, the diagrams, the simple clarity of those margins. They had bridged the years and done what his voice alone could not. And in the boy's eyes now was the rarest thing a man could receive: respect given freely, without being asked for, the kind that can only be won by a life that had quietly held the line when it mattered most. The evening settled softly around them, the last light spilling over the horizon in long golden threads. The air was cool but gentle, carrying the faint scent of rain that had passed earlier in the day. They sat together on the wooden veranda, the old boards creaking faintly under the weight of shared quiet. The manual lay open on the small table between them, its worn pages catching the glow from the single porch bulb, the ink and pencil marks standing out like veins on a living map. The boy leaned forward, elbows on his knees, flipping a page with the same care someone might use when handling a fragile photograph. Every few minutes he pointed at a line, a diagram, a detail, and asked, not in the rushed way of someone looking for quick answers, but in the patient, searching way of someone who wanted to understand. What did this switch do? Why was this step underlined? What had happened that made him change the wording here? The old man didn't hurry his answers. Sometimes he simply smiled and let the boy sit with the question, knowing that half the learning was in the space between asking and knowing. Other times he spoke quietly, telling stories not about glory or medals, but about cold mornings in hangars, about the hum of an engine before takeoff, about nights spent rewriting a single paragraph because the wrong word could mean the wrong action at the wrong time. He didn't tell him how many pilots had been saved because of those pages. He didn't need to. The boy's eyes, bright in the lamplight, following every line as if each was a treasure, told him that the truth had already landed where it needed to. There was no bitterness in him any more about the stolen credit, no ache for recognition in the newspapers or ceremonies. This was better. This was real. Because justice, he realized, wasn't the sound of applause or the flash of cameras. It was this moment, sitting here with the next generation, watching the work live again through curious hands and an open mind. It was knowing that when he was no longer here, those pencil lines, those carefully chosen words, would still carry the weight of his care, guiding someone he would never meet through the sky and safely home again. The boy closed the manual after a while, holding it with both hands as if it belonged to him now, not by ownership, but by inheritance. They sat for a long time without speaking, the quiet between them rich and full. The old man leaned back, eyes on the darkening sky, a small smile resting on his face. Somewhere deep inside, he felt a rare kind of peace, the kind that comes when you know your life's work will not be forgotten, because it has already found its place in another heart.